The morning of June 18, 2014, dawned bright and clear in the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, where Justin Ross Harris lived what appeared to be an ordinary life. He was a 33-year-old web developer at the Home Depot headquarters, a graduate of the University of Alabama with a degree in commerce and business administration, and most importantly, the father of a cherubic 22-month-old boy named Cooper. On this Wednesday morning, as the sun climbed higher in the sky and temperatures began their inexorable rise toward what would become a sweltering 92 degrees, Ross Harris woke with the same responsibilities he carried every workday, preparing his son for daycare and himself for another day at the office. The morning routine unfolded with unremarkable simplicity. Ross secured Cooper into the rear-facing car seat of their SUV, a Hyundai Tucson, and drove to a Chick-fil-A restaurant less than a mile from his office on Cumberland Parkway in Vinings. At approximately 8:57 in the morning, father and son sat together sharing breakfast, a moment of connection in what would later be scrutinized as the final morning of Cooper's short life. The toddler, still groggy from sleep but animated by his father's presence, ate his meal while Ross tended to him with what appeared to be typical parental attention. After finishing their breakfast around 9:20 in the morning, Ross carried Cooper back to the SUV and secured him once again in his car seat. He leaned down and kissed his son, saying words, "Ready, let's go." Cooper, in his innocent affection, returned the kiss. Ross closed the door, slid into the driver's seat, and began the short drive that should have taken him to Cooper's daycare before continuing to his workplace. But at a traffic light just moments into the journey, instead of turning left toward the daycare center, Ross Harris drove straight ahead. For minutes later, at 9:25 in the morning, he parked in his office parking lot on Cumberland Parkway, exited the vehicle, and walked into the Home Depot building, leaving Cooper strapped in his car seat behind him. The summer sun climbed higher. Inside the Tucson, parked in an outdoor lot with no shade, the temperature began to rise with deadly efficiency. By 11:35 in the morning, the temperature inside that vehicle had already reached 88 degrees. Cooper, trapped in his rear-facing seat, unable to free himself, began to suffer. As the minutes stretched into hours, the toddler would have experienced the cruel progression of hyperthermia, nausea, headache, mounting anxiety, and eventually seizures. Small abrasions found on his head, hands, and feet suggested he struggled as he became increasingly uncomfortable, his tiny body making painful contact with the hot components of his car seat. While Cooper endured unimaginable suffering, Ross Harris sat in his cubicle at work. His cell phone records would later reveal that he was far from disconnected from the world. Throughout that morning, he engaged in a flurry of digital activity, sending and receiving explicit text messages and images with 6 different people, including one person under the age of consent. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, 2 co-workers picked him up from work to have lunch at a nearby Publix supermarket. Following lunch, the group proceeded to a Home Depot store on Cumberland Parkway, where Ross purchased light bulbs. Surveillance footage would capture the moment at 12:42 in the afternoon, when he returned to his workplace parking lot, and his friends dropped him off. What happened next became one of the most controversial pieces of evidence in the case. Security cameras recorded Ross Harris approaching his SUV, opening the driver's side door, and placing a bag containing the light bulbs on the front seat. Ross never put his head in the car, and his eye line remained above the car's roof throughout the brief interaction. He closed the door and returned to his office, apparently oblivious to the fact that his son was dying just feet away. By this point, at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the temperature inside the vehicle had climbed past 100 degrees. Cooper Harris, medical examiners would later determine, likely died around noon, roughly 2.5 hours after his father had left him strapped in the car seat. The cause of death would be hyperthermia, the toddler's small body simply unable to survive the relentless heat. At 3:16 in the afternoon, Ross Harris sent a text message to his wife, Leanna Taylor, asking when she would be picking up Cooper from daycare. During a subsequent phone call, Leanna agreed to retrieve their son, while Ross made plans to see the movie 22 Jump Street with friends after work. The casual nature of these communications, exchanged while Cooper's body lay lifeless in the parking lot below, would later strike investigators as deeply disturbing. At 4:16 in the afternoon, approximately 7 hours after initially leaving Cooper in the SUV, Ross returned to the vehicle and drove away from his office parking lot, heading toward the AMC theater where he planned to meet his friends. He had driven only a few minutes, changing lanes as he navigated the afternoon traffic, when he later claimed he noticed Cooper in the back seat. What happened next depended on whose account one believed. Ross pulled into a shopping center parking lot with what witnesses described as squealing tires. He exited the vehicle, removed Cooper's body from the car seat, and placed the toddler on the pavement. Witnesses reported hearing him scream repeatedly, "What have I done? And I've killed my son." He attempted to perform CPR on his son, though one bystander who took over the resuscitation efforts would later testify that Ross was fumbling around and performing the procedure incorrectly. The witness, who had medical training, immediately recognized that Cooper was dead, comparing his attempts to provide breath support to blowing into a busted bag. Police and firefighters who had been patrolling nearby arrived within seconds of the 911 call. They found a chaotic scene, a distraught man, a dead toddler, and a growing crowd of shocked onlookers. Ross Harris was immediately detained for questioning. When officers asked him what had happened, he provided a simple, devastating explanation. He had forgotten that Cooper was still in his car seat. He had simply forgotten. But as police began their investigation, troubling details emerged that transformed what might have been treated as a tragic accident into something far more sinister. During his interrogation, detectives noted that Ross's responses seemed unusual. One officer reported hearing him say, "I can't believe this is happening to me, and I'll be charged with a felony." Statements that seemed to focus more on his own predicament than on his son's death. Officer Brett Gallimore testified that he did not observe Ross cry and felt that Ross was feigning grief. When questioned about why his initial report described Ross as acting hysterical and extremely upset, Gallimore explained that he had deliberately used the word acting to indicate that Ross was not being genuine. Police officer Jacqueline Piper said she thought it was unusual that Ross was not near his son when she arrived on the scene. As detectives delved deeper into Ross Harris's life, they discovered what prosecutors would later characterize as a double life. On the surface, he was a devoted father and husband, frequently posting photos of Cooper on social media and expressing his love for his family. But beneath this veneer, investigators found evidence of extensive extramarital activities. On the very day of Cooper's death, Ross had been engaged in explicit digital communications with 6 different people, exchanging vulgar images and graphic messages. Among these correspondents was at least one minor, a fact that would lead to additional criminal charges. Prosecutors began to construct a theory that went far beyond simple negligence. They argued that Justin Ross Harris had intentionally left Cooper in the car to die because he wanted to be free of his family responsibilities and pursue his extramarital relationships without constraint. To support this explosive allegation, they pointed to internet searches Ross had allegedly conducted regarding child-free lifestyles and a video about the danger of leaving animals in hot cars. They highlighted a text message Ross had sent just 10 minutes before leaving Cooper in the car that morning, a message that read, "I love my son and all, but we both need escapes." The evidence seemed damning, and in a climate of public outrage over Cooper's death, Ross Harris was arrested and charged with malice murder, felony murder, cruelty to children, and dissemination of harmful materials to minors. The case attracted immediate and intense national media attention, with news outlets across the country covering every development. The story had all the elements that captivate public imagination: an innocent child's death, allegations of parental betrayal. The trial began in Cobb County, Georgia, but after nearly 3 weeks of jury selection, Superior Court Judge Mary Staley Clark granted a defense motion for a change of venue. She determined that the extensive local media coverage had made it impossible to find an impartial jury in Cobb County. The trial was moved to Brunswick in Glynn County, hundreds of miles from the scene of Cooper's death. There, a jury of 6 men and 6 women would spend about a month listening to evidence and 4 days deliberating before reaching their verdict. The prosecution's case was exhaustive and methodical. Over the course of the trial, they called 51 witnesses who testified to various aspects of Ross Harris's behavior, his digital communications, his movements on the day of Cooper's death, and the alleged motive behind what they characterized as a deliberate act of murder. 5 women, including 1 minor, took the stand to describe their interactions with Ross. They argued that Ross had conducted internet searches about child-free lifestyles, though this claim would later be contradicted by their own witnesses. The defense, led by attorney Maddox Kilgore, presented a fundamentally different narrative. They argued that Cooper's death was a tragic accident resulting from a memory lapse, a phenomenon that has occurred in dozens of similar cases across the United States. They called 18 witnesses, including experts and character witnesses, who testified that Ross was a loving father. Dr. Gene Brewer, a psychology professor and expert in memory and attention, testified that it was absolutely possible that Ross had left Cooper in the car as a result of a memory failure, and that there was nothing unique about this case as relative to the other cases where this has happened. The defense pointed out that Ross had contacted a travel agent about booking a family vacation the day before Cooper's death, hardly the action of someone planning to kill his child. The most poignant defense witness was Leanna Taylor, Cooper's mother, who had divorced Ross by the time of the trial. She testified that Ross would not have intentionally killed their son. But on cross-examination, prosecutors suggested that in the aftermath of Cooper's death, she had been principally concerned with her future with Ross. On redirect examination, her testimony revealed the depth of her pain and anger. "He destroyed my life. I'm humiliated. I may never trust anybody again. If I never see him again after this day, that's fine." The trial became a battleground over Ross Harris's character and intent. Prosecutors portrayed him as a predator, a pervert, and someone so consumed by his appetites that he was willing to murder his own child to pursue them without impediment. The defense argued that while Ross had certainly engaged in inappropriate and immoral behavior, this did not make him a murderer. They pointed out contradictions in the prosecution's evidence, including Detective Stoddard's testimony about internet searches that other prosecution witnesses said never occurred. They noted that surveillance video contradicted Stoddard's claim that Ross had put his head in the car when depositing the light bulbs. They highlighted the fact that Ross's eyeline remained above the car's roof during that brief interaction. On November 14, 2016, after 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. Guilty on all 8 counts, including malice murder, 2 counts of felony murder, cruelty to children in the first and second degree, criminal attempt to commit a felony, and 2 counts of dissemination of harmful material to minors. Ross Harris stood emotionless as the verdict was read, his fate sealed by 12 strangers who had concluded that he had deliberately left his son to die in a hot car. At the sentencing hearing on December 5, 2016, Judge Mary Staley Clark delivered a scathing condemnation. She stated that the jury had fairly deliberated and discharged their duties, and found the defendant guilty of what factually was a horrific experience for this 22-month-old child who had been placed in the trust of his father. And in violation and dereliction of duty to that child, if not love of that child, callously walked away and left that child in a hot car in June in Georgia in the summer to swelter and die. She sentenced Ross Harris to life in prison without the possibility of parole plus 32 years. But the story did not end there. In January 2017, Ross's legal team filed a motion for a new trial, arguing that the prejudicial testimony about his extramarital affairs and self-admitted addiction had made it impossible for him to receive a fair trial. Judge Clark denied this motion in May 2021. Ross's attorneys appealed to the Georgia Supreme Court, and on January 18, 2022, the state's highest court heard arguments for a new trial. Ross's lawyer, Mitch Durham, argued that the extensive evidence presented about his client's activities was non-probative and prejudicial, doing nothing to prove whether Ross had intentionally left Cooper in the car. On June 22, 2022, in a 6-3 decision, the Georgia Supreme Court agreed. The court found that the evidence regarding Ross's activities was needlessly cumulative and prejudicial, and reversed the convictions on the murder and cruelty counts. The majority opinion stated that prosecutors had introduced a substantial amount of evidence to lead the jury to answer a legally problematic question. What kind of man is Ross? On May 25, 2023, nearly 9 years after Cooper's death, Cobb County District Attorney Flynn Brody announced that the murder and cruelty charges against Ross Harris would not be retried. After an 11-month review, prosecutors determined that the Georgia Supreme Court's decision would prevent them from relying on crucial motive evidence, and without that evidence, they could not secure a conviction. In a statement, Brody explained the painful decision to dismiss the charges that had once seemed so certain. Ross's attorneys characterized the dismissal as a confirmation of their client's innocence. They argued that prosecuting parents for unintentional memory failures does nothing to prevent such tragedies, noting, "Charging a grieving parent for an unintentional memory failure does nothing to prevent the tragedy from happening to another." In fact, child fatalities from hot cars increased after Ross's 2016 trial, the most widely reported hot car death case in history. On Father's Day 2024, 10 years after Cooper's death, Justin Ross Harris walked out of prison a free man, his murder conviction overturned, but his reputation forever tarnished. The case of Cooper Harris remains one of the most controversial and emotionally fraught legal battles in recent Georgia history. It raises profound questions about justice, intent, and the nature of human memory. Was Justin Ross Harris a calculating murderer who killed his own child to pursue a life of freedom? Or was he a flawed man who made a catastrophic error, whose inappropriate behavior poisoned the jury against him and prevented a fair assessment of whether he had intentionally caused his son's death? The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in the complexity of human nature, in the recognition that people can be deeply flawed without being murderers, that memory failures can have catastrophic consequences, and that the criminal justice system sometimes struggles to distinguish between different types of guilt. Cooper Harris died a horrible death in the summer heat of a Georgia parking lot, suffering for hours before his small body succumbed to hyperthermia. Whether his death was the result of criminal intent or a tragic accident, the central fact remains unchanged. A 22-month-old child, who should have been playing at daycare, instead died alone and afraid in the back of his father's car. The case left scars that extend far beyond Justin Ross Harris. Leanna Taylor lost her son and saw her marriage destroyed. The Cobb County community was divided over questions of justice and mercy. The Queen's birthday long weekend in June 2011 began with a familiar ritual for David Prideaux. It was a Saturday morning, the 4th of the month, and a typical gray, drizzly gloom hung over Melbourne. For David, a man of 50, the dreary weather was of little consequence. He was leaving the city behind, escaping the relentless pressure of a life spent behind walls of concrete and steel. He was heading for the mountains, for the crisp, clean air of the Victorian high country, where the only rules were the ones dictated by nature itself. David was not just any man seeking a weekend's respite. He was the general manager of Barwon Prison, a maximum security facility that housed some of Australia's most dangerous men. His world was one of calculated risks, constant vigilance, and the heavy weight of responsibility. To survive in that environment, he had cultivated a persona of meticulous control. He was shrewd, ambitious, and single-minded, a man who observed everything and everyone, who never faced a camera head-on because he was always watching the periphery. His family called him Hubble, a nod to his ever-watchful nature. This meticulousness extended to his passions. As an outdoorsman, he was legendary for his preparedness. He never took risks. His Land Cruiser was a testament to his obsession with planning, packed with top-of-the-line camping gear, a well-stocked first-aid kit, and enough supplies to last for weeks, not days. That morning, he said goodbye to his wife, Joanne, and their 2 children, and pointed his Land Cruiser north, up the Hume Highway. He was meeting his brother-in-law, Rob Dale, for a weekend of deer hunting in the Mansfield State Forest. Rob was married to David's eldest sister, Janine, and the 2 men had forged a strong bond over a shared love for the rugged Australian bush. They were a study in contrasts, David, the high-powered prison boss, and Rob, a down-to-earth equipment distributor. But in the wild, they were equals, partners in the shared pursuit of silence and solitude. They met in Mansfield, the last outpost of civilization before the mountains rise to swallow the sky. Rob transferred his gear into David's immaculate 4WD. They grabbed pies from a local bakery, and then they were off, plunging into the dense, scabby wilderness of the state forest. The landscape was a tangle of regrowth from clear felling years earlier, a place that felt both wild and wounded. They navigated the winding tracks until they reached their destination. Tomahawk Hut, a small, rustic log cabin nestled deep in the hills, a lonely sentinel against the encroaching wilderness. The evening was unremarkable in its normality. They unpacked, David arranging his expensive gear with practiced precision. They ate dinner, drank some Shiraz, and shared the easy jokes of men comfortable in each other's company and in the profound quiet of the bush. They talked about hunting, about family, about the simple things that lie beyond the grasp of city life. As the temperature dropped, they retired early, the forest outside wrapped in a cold, deep silence. They were awake at 6 the next morning, Sunday, June 5th. A chill was in the air, a precursor to the snow that was forecast to fall later in the day. David, ever the pragmatist, moved his belongings from the hut into the back of his Land Cruiser, locking it securely. He was convinced that the dirt bikers who frequented the area would steal anything left unattended. Rob, less concerned, left his things in the hut. By 7:45 a.m., they were ready. Dressed in camouflage thermal gear, they each shouldered a rifle and a backpack, every item a reflection of David's meticulous planning. Energy bars, a thermos of hot coffee, ammunition, and a UHF radio set to Channel 8. David also carried a GPS, another layer of his personal safety net. Just 100 yards from the hut, the track split into a fork. To the right, a muddy path climbed steeply over a saddle. To the left, the road curved more gently along an escarpment, flanked by a gate. They had a simple plan to ensure they wouldn't accidentally shoot one another. Rob would take the high road over the saddle. David would take the lower track along the escarpment. As they parted ways, Rob would later recall the last words his friend and brother-in-law ever spoke to him. David, snug in his brand-new thermals, grinned and said, "I'm warm as toast. I might even get hot." Then he turned and walked down the track, a solitary figure in camouflage, and vanished into the gray morning mist. Rob Dale climbed the steep track, the wind biting at his face. He quickly realized the hunt was a bust. The wind was blowing his scent straight down the gully, a rookie mistake that would send any deer in the vicinity fleeing for cover. Instead of wasting his energy, he found a spot to sit, hoping his scent might inadvertently flush a deer out for David. As he sat in the quiet, he heard the buzz of 2 dirt bikes approaching the hut. They paused at the fork in the road, then their engines whined as they sped away up the ridge. He didn't hear another sound all morning. Around 11:30 a.m., Rob headed back to Tomahawk Hut. He was relieved to see that nothing had been stolen. He ate his lunch, assuming David was deep in the zone, perhaps stalking a deer with the silent, patient focus of a true hunter. A good hunter can spend hours moving just a few yards, he would later explain. It was a chess match, and the last thing you did was blast the radio and spook the prey. So Rob decided to wait. He thought he'd cut some firewood to pass the time, but the chainsaw was locked in David's 4WD, and David had the keys. A small flicker of apprehension ignited within him, but he tamped it down. He began collecting fallen wood by hand, his ears trained on the silent forest, waiting for the sound of his friend's return. As the afternoon light began to fade, the apprehension grew into a gnawing unease. By 4:30 p.m., the silence was no longer peaceful, it was oppressive. Rob switched on his UHF radio and set it to scan. On Channel 8, their agreed-upon frequency, there was only static. On another channel, he picked up the faint, garbled chatter of distant voices, likely background noise from Mansfield miles away. The mountain itself was silent. He started walking up the road, calling David's name, his voice swallowed by the vast emptiness. The sun dipped below the ridge, plunging the forest into a deep, cold darkness. He checked his phone. No signal. He returned to the hut, grabbing a torch and fresh batteries for the radio, his mind racing through possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. At 6 p.m., the unease turned to full-blown panic. He left the hut again, hiking back up the hill, his torch beam cutting a frantic, lonely swath through the blackness, his calls for David growing more desperate. Finally, 2 miles up the track, a single bar of reception appeared on his phone. He called David. The call went straight to voicemail. His message was a raw burst of fear and frustration. "I'm worried," he said, his voice tight. He told the disembodied voice of the machine that he was giving David 2 minutes before he called 000. He didn't know it then, but it was a futile gesture. David's phone was locked in the Land Cruiser, silent and unreachable. The Mansfield police arrived at 9:45 p.m., their flashing lights painting the dark, wet trees in surreal strokes of red and blue. The weather had turned, just as predicted. A bitter wind drove sheets of rain through the forest, and the temperature was plummeting. They found Rob setting up torches around the hut, a small island of light in an ocean of darkness. When they asked why he hadn't called earlier, his response was a frustrated shrug. What would I say? He didn't come back for lunch. In what would become the first in a series of blunders that would plague the investigation, the officers told Rob to fire his rifle into the air to attract attention. Rob, keenly aware of how suspicion could fall on the last person to see someone alive, told them he hadn't fired his gun all day and asked them to check it, to verify it for the record. They waved him off, saying they believed him. So Rob fired into the night, the sound echoing and then dying unanswered. By first light on Monday, a full-scale search was underway. Local search teams were joined by the elite search and rescue squad from Melbourne. The police Air Wing's helicopter beat the air above, its cameras scanning the dense canopy, while on the ground, hundreds of volunteers from the State Emergency Service and Bush Search and Rescue fanned out, a small army of hope against the vast, indifferent wilderness. Tomahawk Hut became a command center, a chaotic hub of maps, GPS trackers, and radios. By the middle of the week, the volunteers were searching in knee-deep snow, the cold a constant, biting enemy. They searched for 5 days. They searched with a grid matrix overlaid on a topographic map, ticking off every coordinate within a nearly 3-mile radius. They brought in canine teams from both Corrections Victoria and the Victoria Police, dogs trained to find the faintest scent of human life or death. They found nothing. The only things ever recovered were a small, new price tag for $59.95, of the kind one might find on camping gear, and a single boot print that matched the size and make of David's boots. But of David himself, or his rifle, or his GPS, or his backpack, there was not a single trace. The official search was called off. More searches were launched in the following months, and in the years since, spurred on by the family and volunteers. In 2013, a bushfire swept through the area, clearing the dense undergrowth and revealing the secret contours of the land. It revealed no sign of David Prideaux. The conclusion, for many, was inescapable. If he was on that mountain, they would have found him. The disappearance of David Prideaux was a stone dropped into the calm surface of a family, and the ripples fractured them into pieces. The 9 Prideaux siblings, a sprawling, complicated clan, cleaved into 2 distinct, warring factions. On one side were David's brothers, Stephen and Paul. They were convinced David, the most capable man they knew, had not fallen victim to the mountain. They believed he was murdered, and they wanted the world to know. On the other side were David's wife, Joanne, and his older brother, Peter, who was also a high-ranking prison warden. They held to the belief that David had suffered an accident, a heart attack perhaps, and they wanted him to be left to rest in peace on the mountain he loved. They wanted the questions, the speculation, and the media attention to stop. "I know in my heart that David's body is still up there on that mountain," Peter said, his voice terse with frustration. The most logical theory, and the one officially adopted by the police and later the coroner, was that David had died from an accident or a medical episode. He could have fallen into a ravine, his body obscured by the rugged terrain, or suffered a sudden heart attack, collapsing in a place the searchers simply missed. It happens. Hikers and climbers have been found years, even decades later, their bodies perfectly preserved by snow and ice. But the Victorian Alps are not the Himalayas. The search had been exhaustive. The cadaver dogs, whose senses are far more acute than human eyes, had found no scent. And above all, there was the character of David himself. This was a man who never took risks, who was always overprepared. The idea that he could simply get lost or have a fatal, untraceable accident struck his brothers Stephen and Paul as impossible. "The story doesn't fit," Stephen insisted. "If not an accident, then what?" Suspicion inevitably turned to the only other person on the mountain that day, Rob Dale. Could he have accidentally shot his brother-in-law and in a panic covered it up? The theory held a certain grim logic. Rob could have taken the keys from David's body, driven the Land Cruiser off the mountain to dispose of the body, and returned to the hut before raising the alarm. The police's failure to secure and analyze David's car, which was used as a shuttle vehicle during the search, was a critical error that left this possibility hanging in the air. When a journalist finally tracked Rob Dale down and put the question to him directly, his denial was instant and adamant. "No," he said curtly. "If I'd shot Hubble, I'd have been the first in Mansfield turning myself in." Senior police investigators, who had interviewed him extensively, agreed. His story never changed, never wavered. His phone records backed up his account. They were convinced he was telling the truth. With accident and misadventure seemingly ruled out by David's character and the failed search, and with the only other person on the mountain cleared, a third, far more sinister theory began to take shape. A theory rooted in the dark, violent world David inhabited professionally. This theory had a name, Carl Williams. Just 14 months before David Prideaux disappeared, Carl Williams, Melbourne's most notorious gangland kingpin, was brutally murdered inside Barwon Prison. He was bludgeoned to death with the seat stem of an exercise bike by a fellow inmate, Matthew Johnson. At the time, Williams was a high-value police informant, providing information about unsolved murders and police corruption in exchange for a reduced sentence and benefits for his family. His murder, inside the state's most secure prison, under the supposedly watchful eyes of guards and 37 CCTV cameras, was a scandal of monumental proportions. An ombudsman's report later detailed a series of catastrophic failures, from ignored warnings about the threat Johnson posed to an ineffective camera monitoring system that allowed Williams to lie dead and undiscovered for nearly half an hour. David Prideaux, as the general manager of Barwon, was at the very center of this storm. He was one of the first on the scene after Williams's murder, even though he was off duty at the time, and he took control of the situation with his customary efficiency. The murder raised 1,000 questions about corruption and complicity. Stephen and Paul Prideaux came to believe that Williams had been allowed to be murdered, and that their brother David, whether complicit or simply a witness to the truth, had become a liability, a potential leak that needed to be plugged. This theory was supercharged by a single, explosive rumor, that David Prideaux had come into possession of a CD-ROM containing the entirety of Carl Williams's secret statements to police. If true, that CD was a stick of dynamite. It contained allegations that could bring down powerful figures in both the underworld and the police force. Dead men tell no tales, the old saying goes, and if David had that CD, he was a man who knew too much. He had a motive to be silenced. David's wife and the police vehemently denied the CD ever existed. But for Stephen and Paul, it was the key that unlocked the entire mystery. As compelling as the conspiracy was, it had its own flaws. For a professional hit, The Victorian Alps were an absurdly inconvenient and unreliable location. Melbourne's gangland killers were known for crude, lazy methods. A spray of bullets into a car or a house, not for orchestrating a complex interception of an armed hunter in a remote state forest 3 hours from the city. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no evidence of a third party on the mountain. This left one final and probable theory, that David Prideaux had manufactured his own disappearance, that he had simply walked away from his life. This idea gained some traction in 2012 when a former colleague claimed to have seen him at an ATM in Broome, Western Australia. But the bank had no CCTV, and the sighting was never confirmed. The 2014 coronial inquest officially dismissed the theory as fiction. David's bank accounts, his passport, his Medicare card, his email, nothing had been touched since the day he vanished. If he had faked his own death, he had done so with a masterful, ghost-like precision, leaving behind no digital or financial footprint. In July 2014, the state coroner delivered the official verdict. David Prideaux was declared deceased. The cause of death was unknown, but it was likely the result of an accident or a medical event. Foul play was ruled out. For the state, the case was closed. But for Stephen Prideaux, it was a profound injustice. He later discovered that the family had not even been properly notified that the inquest was taking place. It felt like another door being slammed shut, another layer of secrecy in a case already shrouded in it. The disappearance of David Prideaux remains a profound and unsettling Australian mystery. The man who was always there, the one everyone turned to in a crisis, had stepped into the wilderness and evaporated without a trace. He left behind a fractured family, a cloud of ugly rumors, and a series of maddeningly unanswerable questions. His brothers Stephen and Paul continued to search, driven by a need for truth in a case where there is none. They returned to the mountain, a place Stephen now hates, sifting through the silence, looking for a ghost. If someone had drawn up an old map of this place, he once said, gesturing to the unforgiving landscape, over the area David disappeared, they'd have written, "Here be dragons." In the end, the man who was never lost, the ultimate survivor, was consumed by the wilderness, leaving behind only the cold, echoing silence where a life used to be. In the lush, vibrant landscape of Costa Rica, a country celebrated for its pura vida, ethos of peace and natural beauty, a dark and violent undercurrent runs deep. It is the shadow of femicidio, the murder of women, a scourge born from a culture of machismo and gender-based violence that tarnishes the nation's tranquil image. In this world, Eva Moreira Aloa, at just 19 years old, was becoming a voice. She was a daughter, a devoted mother to her 3-year-old son, and a passionate student of social work. She was a young woman who felt the sting of this societal poison in her own life and was determined to fight it, not just for herself, but for all the women who lived in its shadow. Her social media was a testament to her burgeoning activism, a space where she shared messages of empowerment and condemned the violence that plagued her society. Eva was not just living her life, she was trying to change the world she lived in. But the very monster she was fighting was closer than she could have ever imagined. It had a name, and it was a name she knew intimately, Randall Garrido Oviedo. Their relationship had not begun in violence. It had begun, as many do, with the deceptive blush of affection and promise. Randall was the father of her son, a man who should have been her partner and protector. But the promise had long since curdled into a nightmare. Randall was not a partner, he was a warden. He was a man steeped in a world of criminality, a seasoned offender with a history of robbery and drug trafficking that stretched back to his teenage years. His life was a web of violence and control, and Eva was caught in its center. The love she had once felt had been suffocated by a relentless campaign of emotional, psychological, and physical abuse. He sought to break her spirit, to manipulate her into a corner of helpless submission. For a time, she felt trapped, a prisoner in her own life, the light at the end of the tunnel seemingly extinguished by the suffocating darkness of his control. But Eva's spirit was not so easily broken. She was a fighter, The same fire that fueled her activism gave her the strength to seek a way out. Her chance came in an unexpected form. Randall's criminal enterprises finally caught the attention of the Costa Rican police. He was arrested, and for a brief, hopeful period, he was behind bars. For Eva, it was a breath of fresh air, a space to escape the chokehold of his control. She made the courageous decision to leave him, to build a new life for herself and her young son, free from the terror that had defined her days. She moved back in with her parents, just 5 blocks away from where Randall's family lived, creating a small pocket of safety and peace. She was finally free, but Randall's release from prison was a dark cloud on the horizon, a promise of a storm she knew was coming. A man like Randall Garita Oviedo does not simply let go. The 1st of November, 2019, was a Friday. The day was drawing to a close, the tropical evening air settling over the town of Barva de Heredia. Eva, having spent the day free from the shadow of her ex-partner, had a simple, unavoidable task to perform. She had to go to the home of Randall's parents to pick up her son. It was a journey into the heart of the territory she had fought so hard to escape, a necessary evil in the complicated aftermath of their shattered relationship. She had no way of knowing that Randall would be there, waiting. And she had no way of knowing that he was not interested in a simple exchange of their child. He had other, far more malicious intentions. From the moment she arrived, the air was thick with a familiar, suffocating tension. Randall immediately began his campaign of persuasion, his words a toxic mix of feigned remorse and veiled threats. He wanted her back. He needed her back. For Randall, Eva was not a person to be loved. She was an object to be possessed, a symbol of the control he craved. Eva, however, was no longer the frightened girl he had once dominated. She had tasted freedom, and she would not willingly return to her cage. She was sick and tired of his empty words, of the cyclical nature of his abuse. She refused. Her refusal was not a negotiation. It was a declaration of her independence, a final, defiant stand. Her defiance ignited his rage. The quiet persuasion escalated into a heated verbal argument. Voices were raised, the thin veneer of civility stripped away to reveal the raw, violent anger that simmered just beneath Randall's surface. What exactly was said in those final, fraught moments remains locked in the silence of the grave and the lies of a killer. But the outcome was swift, brutal, and absolute. At some point during the argument, as Eva turned her back on him, a final, symbolic act of dismissal, Randall pulled out a gun. It was an illegal weapon, another tool of his criminal trade. And in a final, monstrous act of control, he fired twice, shooting the mother of his child in the back. The horror of that moment was magnified by the presence of 2 tiny, innocent witnesses. Eva's 3-year-old son and Randall's 5-year-old son from a previous relationship were in the room. They saw it all. They saw their father raise a gun and shoot a woman they loved. It was a trauma so profound, so elemental, that it would forever be seared into their minds, a wound that no amount of time or therapy could ever truly heal. They were victims, too, their innocence shattered by the deafening roar of a gunshot and the sight of a mother falling to the floor. As Eva lay fighting for her life, the sound of the gunshots brought Randall's parents running. They knew their son. They knew the depths of his violence, the cruelty he was capable of. They had seen his abuse of Eva firsthand. Without hesitation, they did the only thing they could. They called the police. Neighbors, who had also heard the shots, did the same. As Randall tried to make a run for it, to escape the consequences of his ultimate act of cowardice, the police arrived. His own parents, in a heartbreaking but necessary act of betrayal, threw their son under the bus, telling the officers exactly what he had done. While Randall was being arrested, emergency services rushed to Eva's side. She had a weak pulse, a fragile thread of life that was quickly slipping away. They loaded her into an ambulance and raced to the nearest hospital. But the damage was too great. The bullets had done their work. Shortly after her arrival, 19-year-old Eva Moreira Aloa, the daughter, the mother, the advocate, was pronounced dead. The task of informing Eva's family fell to the police. Her parents, Alina and her husband, were at home, just 5 blocks away from the scene of the crime, blissfully unaware of the horror that had just unfolded. The phone call, when it came, shattered their world. Alina would later recall the moment with a chilling clarity. How time seemed to stop when she heard Eva's name on the other end of the line. They were called to the scene, a chaotic tableau of flashing police lights and yellow crime scene tape. An officer asked Alina to describe what Eva had been wearing when she left the house. The question hung in the air, a harbinger of an unbearable truth. As Alina confirmed her daughter's attire, the officer spoke the words that no mother should ever have to hear. "Ma'am," he said, his voice heavy with a grim sympathy, "I wish we could tell you that it's not your daughter, but it is." In the aftermath, Randall's parents continued to cooperate with the police, their grief for the woman their son had murdered overriding any misguided loyalty. They helped investigators locate the murder weapon, which Randall had wedged into a brick wall behind the house. The full scope of Randall's violent history began to come to light, a long and sordid tale of a man who was a danger to society from the very beginning. His reign of terror was finally over. Eva's funeral was held on November 3rd, 2019. It was an event that captured the attention of a nation. Her death had become a symbol of the femicide crisis that plagued Costa Rica. The president of the country, Carlos Alvarado, issued a statement expressing his deep sadness over the murder of Eva and all the other women who had been victims of violence. Eva's story was a rallying cry, a stark and brutal reminder of the real-life consequences of a culture that too often tolerates violence against women. In the wake of the tragedy, custody of Eva's young son was granted to her parents, who were left to raise their grandson in the shadow of an unthinkable loss, a boy who would have to navigate life with the memory of his father murdering his mother. The trial of Randall Garita Oviedo began in July 2021, nearly 2 years after he took Eva's life. The courtroom was the final battleground in the fight for justice for Eva. The prosecution laid out a clear and damning case, presenting a mountain of evidence that detailed the long and brutal history of abuse in their relationship. They presented witness testimonies and argued that Randall had every intention of ending Eva's life on the day of the crime. His actions, they argued, were not a crime of passion, but the final, calculated act of a man who could not stand to lose control. The defense, in a move that was as predictable as it was insulting, attempted to blame the victim. They claimed that Randall had acted in a fit of jealous rage after seeing Eva receive an intimate video call from another man. It was a desperate, flimsy argument, an attempt to paint Eva as the provocateur and Randall as the heartbroken lover, a narrative that crumbled in the face of the overwhelming evidence of his long-standing abuse and violent nature. The jury saw through the lies. They deliberated and returned with a verdict, guilty. Randall Garita Oviedo was convicted of the murder of Eva Moreira Aloa. The judge sentenced him to the maximum penalty allowed under Costa Rican law, 35 years in prison. For Eva's family, it was a measure of justice, but it was not a cure for their pain. The sentence meant that one day, a man who had stolen so much would be free to walk the streets again, while their daughter was forever lost to them. The story of Eva Moreira Aloa is a profound and heartbreaking tragedy, but it is also a story of a voice that refuses to be silenced. In her death, Eva became a powerful symbol, her story igniting a national conversation and fueling the fight against gender-based violence. Eva's voice, the voice that was so brutally silenced on that November evening, now echoes in the protests, in the advocacy, and in the unwavering determination of a community to create a world where no woman has to live in fear. She was a victim of a monstrous crime, but her legacy is one of a fighter, a hero, a seed of hope in the long and arduous battle for a pura vida that is pure and safe for everyone.